Okay, we'll start admitting our guests.
Good morning, everyone from the Philippines. Good morning and happy Easter to all of you. Welcome to the ASEAN University Network on Ecological Education and Culture, AUN-EEC workshop on citizen science for addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in Southeast Asia. You are joining us today here via Zoom and YouTube. It is now 9 a.m. local time here in Manila, and I am your host and moderator, Dr. Inez Ponce de Leon, an associate professor from the Department of Communication at the Ateneo de Manila University. This plenary session today is being recorded and it is streamed via YouTube. So before we begin, we have a few ground rules. Please note that our program today is being recorded on Zoom. While you are on Zoom, all participants will be muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Throughout the session, you can use our chat box. Kindly type in any of your comments or questions here. Those who are on YouTube can also type their questions and comments in the comments section, and we will open these later for the open forum. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Any requests for e-certificates may be made through that same form. So, before we begin this morning's event, I would like to invite Dr. Asunta Cuyugueng, Director of the AUN Ecological Education and Culture, for some remarks.
Thank you, Inez. And once again, welcome to the participants of this ASEAN University Network on Ecological Education and Culture. This workshop especially is on citizen science for addressing UN SDGs in Southeast Asia. On this fine morning, we hope you are further energized by what this workshop has in store for you. It has been prepared with much love for the topic. And this is thanks to Dr. Zida Muhammad of University of Malaya and Ms. Trinket Constantino and Ms. Abi Favis of Ateneo de Manila University. Their commitment to citizen science springs from a desire to share their love and concern for the environment. The field has become all the more important now that most of us were left to our own devices to learn while being away from our physical school structures. So my sincere thanks to Zida, Trinket, and Abby for making this happen. Many thanks too to Dr. Inez Ponce de Leon, who will be guiding us through this morning's activities. To our honored speakers and facilitators, welcome and thank you for helping us engage our audience. I'm sure the audience will take away many good ideas from this morning's activities. To our AUN-EEC organizing team, Ms. Jean Hardeleza Mijares, Mr. Chris Castillo and his team, and Mr. Kim Campos, thank you once again for helping us create a great virtual experience. And to all of you who found time to learn more about citizen science, may these ideas that you hear this morning be planted in your head and in your heart so that they may one day grow and blossom and change the way we learn, change the way we do things, change the way we live. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Mama Chu, Dr. Cuyugueng. I really love what you said. Let all of these ideas come to you and blossom. So let's all start that blossoming experience today because we have a lot in store for you. As an overview, we will start this event with our plenary session on citizen science, this one, as a tool for filling in gaps on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. After this, we will have an open forum. After the keynote speech, we will have an open forum, and then we will have an introduction to the workshops and the workshop proper. There will be 4 major workshop sessions where you will learn more about using citizen science in Southeast Asia, particularly on managing plastic waste, monitoring coral reefs, conserving water resources, and cataloging urban biodiversity. I hope you are excited as we all are about today's activities because we will learn not just about citizen science, but how these activities fit in our contexts here in Southeast Asia. We now begin with our keynote. Our first speaker is Professor Darlene Cavalier. She is a professor of practice at Arizona State University's School for the Future of Innovation and Society and the Senior Global Futures Scientist, the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at ASU. Professor Cavalier is the founder of SciStarter, which is a popular citizen science portal and a research platform connecting millions of people to real science that they can do. She is also the founder of Science Cheerleaders. It's a nonprofit organization comprising current and former NFL, NBA, and college cheerleaders, all pursuing STEM careers. The co-founder of ECAST, or Expert and Citizen Science Assessment of Science and Technology, and the co-founder of ScienceNearMe.org. She is a founding board member of the Citizen Science Association, an advisor and fellow at the National Geographic, a member of the US EPA's National Advisory Council for Environmental Policy and Technology, and has been appointed to the National Academy of Sciences Designing Citizen Science to Support Science Learning Committee. She has also been named co-chair of America 250's Innovation, Science, and Entrepreneurism Advisory Council, and is the co-editor of The Rightful Place of Science, Citizen Science, author of The Science of Cheerleading, and co-author of the Field Guide to Citizen Science, published under Timber Press. Today, Professor Cavalier resides in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Sadly, we can't have Professor Cavalier today, but she prepared a recorded speech for us. She is currently in New York, still in the Easter holiday. Let's now hear the keynote of Professor Darlene Cavalier.
I'm Darlene Cavalier from SciStarter and Arizona State University, and it's my honor to be here to talk about SciStarter, citizen science, and their relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to share my screen, show you some slides. So this is what we're talking about, citizen science, sustainable development goals. As I mentioned, I'm Darlene Cavalier. I'm a professor of practice at Arizona State University in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. I'm also a senior global future scientist with the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University, and the founder of SciStarter that we're going to learn a little bit more about. So we'll talk about citizen science and SciStarter, how scientists leverage SciStarter to advance and accelerate their research, how facilitators and educators and community-based organizations leverage SciStarter and citizen science, and how this all scales and helps to open up SDG efforts. And then we'll just give a little shout out to Citizen Science Month at the end. So many of you probably already know this, and if you're tuning in, you probably are one of the millions of people that enjoy science and nature. And now we know thousands of scientists actually need their help. They can't always find each other. So we help connect them. And we help them through something called citizen science, a way for people who are curious or concerned about something to take action on the issue. And at the same time, they're usually helping to answer a research question that no one person can answer on their own. So it's how we can all make an impact on issues that we care about. Someone you know or you are a citizen scientist. eBird is a very popular citizen science program. This is an app where people help to catalog and record bird ornithology observations. It's 1.5 million reports came in January alone. Water testing in the United States, there's an estimated 1.5 million people who volunteer to test and monitor the quality of rivers, streams, and lakes. And then there's a type of citizen science that's a little more passive. This is SETI at home. 5 million people plus have already downloaded a software program that allows the spare processing time in their computers to be used to search for life in space. Half of what we know about climate change came from citizen scientists. And this we know in part because now it's in a formal field. People actually study the field of citizen science. That stat there came from my colleague at North Carolina State University, Dr. Karen Cooper. So SciStarter, we'll move over to this a little bit. SciStarter connects citizen scientists, these are volunteers, to more than 2,000 projects, mostly projects, sometimes events and tools. This is actually now closing in on 130,000 registered active community members that we can mobilize at any given time to get involved in a citizen science project. That's in addition to the millions of visitors who turn to SciStarter to find their next citizen science project. This is a pretty busy slide, but in essence, it's trying to get across what SciStarter does. There are tools that help people organize data from trusted sources, and these are data about projects, metadata about projects. SciStarter aggregates those from all over the world. There are dashboards that help the individual who's involved showcase their participation, embedded assessments that help researchers evaluate the outcomes, the learning outcomes of these projects, analytics that help support outreach strategies, Are the right messages reaching the right people, and are the right people involved in these projects, and also who's left out. AI powered recommendation system. We're really excited about that. Doesn't help to have 2,000 projects if you have to sort through all of them and waste your time trying to find one. We use smart systems in place to help you find the best project to get involved in, and lots of social media integration. Typically, somebody will add a project, event, or a tool. You do that. If you have a project, event, or tool, everything's free. Go ahead and add it. And then there's lots of different ways that people can use to find the right project for them. I am zooming in right now from New Jersey in the United States. And so I can simply use all of these different filters to find a project I can do at the beach that's suitable for adults. And this is another example of what the project finder looks like. And you can see all the keywords on the left. You can search by topic, location, of course, keyword, at age group. And I'm going to show you something really exciting later that has something to do with the SDGs. Our tools benefit everyone in citizen science. Let's take a look at what we do for the participants, the volunteers. They can track and earn credit for their contributions to projects, even those that are not hosted by SciStarter. So a lot of projects use APIs that we're going to talk about in a moment. In essence, we hope that people find something. They may need to go to, chances are they have to go to another website or an app, Zooniverse, iNaturalist. I mentioned others already. So when they do these projects, it reports back to SciStarter how frequently they're contributing to those projects. And this is opt-in, and you'll look and see all the privacy considerations that we take into account too. People can earn badges. There's a Girl Scout badge on the right, and there's a foundational badge in the middle there. Then you have a personal dashboard where you can help find the best, where we can help you find the best projects to get involved in next. We are already seeing that people get involved in 3 to 5 projects once they do one. And this is a great way to just track contributions, stay in the know about different projects that you're interested in. And sometimes you might need to show these contributions or these dashboards to your troop leader, your teacher, your professor, your company, if you're involved in a corporate volunteer program through SciStarter. This is evidence that just kind of consolidates it from all over the web. So many projects, hundreds of projects report back to SciStarter how frequently people from SciStarter are participating. This is just one representative example. If you're interested, check out the affiliate projects. Those are all the projects that use the API to help you track all your contributions. And then, of course, if you're new to citizen science, we really encourage you to just go to YouTube, look up for the SciStarter channel, and look for the how-to video stream. These are from project scientists. As you can see here, they're usually in the 2 to 3 minute range, just showing you exactly what to do, how to get involved, why to get involved, and what to expect. We also offer training for beginners at scistarter.org/trainer. This is an interactive module available in Spanish and English that was developed by the instructional designers at Arizona State University. You can see all the learning objectives here. All of this is free, and there are also materials for you to help facilitate introductions to citizen science to your communities too. We work a lot with libraries, public libraries, hundreds of libraries, and that just keeps expanding. Use our resources to help introduce people to citizen science, and also move some kits, physical kits, into circulation. Typically, you don't need much more than a cell phone or a computer and internet to engage in projects, but every so often you might need a specialized sensor, an air quality sensor. Also, this is just a fun one. These are clip-on magnifying lenses for your phone to get involved in some of the biodiversity related projects. It also allows for a localization of global projects to take place by doing things like putting in a local field guide to help people understand what they should expect to see. So somebody using this kit might be involved in an iNaturalist project to go out and document biodiversity near them. That's simply done by taking pictures of things that are alive, plants, animals, trees, and then you share it through an app, in this case, iNaturalist, and then thousands of scientists and millions of people have access to that data. Arizona State University and SciStarter partner a lot to look for barriers and then do everything that we can to lower those barriers. These are barriers to entry, barriers to participation, who's not included, where are the project gaps happening too. this is how we came up with the library project, that we were able to look at data on SciStarter that showed us people were looking at saving certain projects, but never joining them. And then we did a research project and found that really lack of confidence in understanding where, how, or why to get some specialized equipment was a huge, huge barrier. So now they're available. These kits are available in libraries. This is the participation API. This is mostly for project scientists. Use these free tools. Go to scistarter.org API. It looks like the I carried over a little bit. And you'll see the documentation. Everything is open. You'll see the documentation of how to connect your project and your website or app directly to SciStarter so participants can earn credit. And those projects are the ones that we give a lot of marketing love to too. And there's People Finder. So it's a very simple way for a project leader to drop a pin on a map, scale that circle as you see fit. You will automatically see how many participants are within that geographic range, how many project owners are there too, in case you want to meet the project owners. And you just send them a message. This is great for an immediate call to action. Maybe there's something in particular, a dragonfly swarm, and you know that it's hitting the northeast part of your country. This is a really easy way to start to target people who are located right in that area to get involved in your project and share some observations. These are just typical project stats for a project leader. So if you use SciStarter, you have access to all these stats for your project. And it shows how your project stacks up relative to other projects on the site too. So we encourage you, project leaders, to check out these free tools. They're made available, made possible by support from the National Science Foundation. We're going to skip this a little bit. These are organizations that we work with. Some are funders, some are partners. The organizations are key to helping us have many, many, many more people learn about citizen science and get involved in ways that build confidence and efficacy, maximize opportunities for learning outcomes, create loyal citizen scientists who give repeat data, which is important, and are good citizen scientists in terms of their data. So our partners that we work with include America 250. So this is America is turning 250 in a couple of years. So we're working with them to get back to our roots in enabling everybody to get involved in science. NASA, you'll see some fun things that we've done with them that we plan to do again. These are fun, interactive online events. NASA SitSciCon. Girl Scouts here in the United States are huge. We work within the boundaries and the motivations and the operational and executive style of our partners. All we do is help curate, and we're kind of the citizen science experts that find the right projects for these different partners. And then of course we provide all the analytics back to measure collective impact. This is cool too. These are researchers. Researchers use SciStarter, in particular researchers at North Carolina State University and Arizona State University. So they look at the taxonomy of the project and metadata about all these projects and events. They map that to the people who use the site as well. And so we can see more, and we're learning a lot more about participants' motivations, behaviors, and learning outcomes, and how they fit into this huge citizen science ecosystem. If anybody's interested in learning more about that research, just email me at Darlene, D-A-R-L-E-N-E @scistarter.org, and I'm going to link you up with the researchers. Pretty soon on SciStarter, you'll actually see all the research published on a spiffy looking page that's under development. There's social network analysis. This was really cool to see the outcomes of, because we long suspected that people involved in one project were involved in multiple projects. And we have the data, but it's really nice to see this stuff published here. And then understanding the volunteer outcomes. All of this is really important. We have to understand what's happening and who we're serving, who we're not serving, so we can help support people through the continuum of engagement. Websites, if you run a website out there and you really don't feel like creating your own database, but you want to offer citizen science up to your users, we have a very free and simple plugin that we call a widget. And so you can just plug citizen science into your site from SciStarter. All the work that we do in aggregating and normalizing all the data from all these different projects and sources, we clean that, we deduplicate it, and we offer it up to anybody who would like to offer on their site. And you can customize it too. These are just two popular sites in the United States that bring citizen science to their visitors through SciStarter. And this is just a very confusing looking graph that just shows you lots of information that goes into SciStarter, and then how we look for revealing different relationships, as you can see there, facilitate connections through some of the organizations that I mentioned before, help project leaders streamline recruitment and really lighten their burden, their technological and financial investment in their project. Hopefully our tools and our shared community can help lighten that burden for them a little bit, and identify blocks to engagement. Why does all of this matter? It's because these combined efforts are increasing the amount and quality of reliable, current, and consistent data that is critical for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Here's more. Here's the part that I think is pretty exciting too. Thousands of existing projects are now mapped to Sustainable Development Goals by citizen scientists. Our partners at OSDG, there's a website, have actually turned the act of mapping projects to SDGs into a citizen science project. So now all the projects that are in SciStarter are exported through an API, and citizen scientists are working to map them to an SDG. And this is really cool, partly because of this next part. Now, if you're a person coming to SciStarter looking for a project to get involved in, we have a new search filter field. See that arrow there? Now you can search for projects by relevant sustainable development goals. So there you have it. This is how, I don't know, I'm very excited about this project because it's really helping to map and add structure to citizen science projects and align them with SDGs in ways that we hadn't seen before. So I want to just thank our partners there too. So moving on, some of the more or additional deliberate connections are in the form of papers. I believe this one is already published, Mapping Citizen Science Contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Here you can look and see where there's an overview of how citizen science is already contributing, but could be contributing a lot more to the framework here. So the big takeaway with this is a systematic review of metadata and work plans of the 244 SDG indicators. Honestly, didn't realize there were that many, as well as the identification of past and ongoing citizen science initiatives through SciStarter and from SciStarter and other sources. They look at these to see what can directly or indirectly provide data for these indicators. So what we're helping with our friends at the OSDG, what we're helping with is first looking at the landscape of projects that collect observational data, right? So citizen science is usually when there's data gaps, a scientist will set up a way for the public to add data there. And so the project itself has metadata. That's what SciStarter collects. And our partners are using that to map them to the right indicators. That's the first step. In addition, then the observational data that comes through those projects, that's some interesting work that you're going to hear more from the other keynote speaker, Mendel. You'll hear a lot more from him about how the observational data is being organized and normalized to really accelerate research within the framework. Now let's see some more. These results of some of this early work already indicates that citizen science is already contributing. We know that to the monitoring of 5 of the indicators. Citizen science could contribute to at least 76 indicators, or 33%. The greatest inputs relate to life on land, sustainable cities and communities, good health and well-being, and clean water and sanitation. Not at all surprising. And so there is a case study with a paper in the works. It's under review right now that looks at strengthening measurement of marine litter in Ghana. And I have all of this up here so that you can take some time. I'm going to share these slides and actually take a look more at the link that's here. It's really cool. It's a story map. So they actually go through and share with you the case study. Specifically, they looked at plastics in water, which of course everywhere in the world seems to be a big issue that's affecting not just environmental health, but human health, of course. And so I'll just read the quote that came in from our colleague here. One of the key goals of the project in Ghana was to harness existing networks and citizen science initiatives already taking place to foster more efficient and sustainable data collection that feeds into official SDG monitoring and reporting processes. So again, there's the metadata about the projects. Now we're talking about the data collected through those projects, the observational data. It's been a great success. For the first time in Ghana, the country will report on SDG 14.1.1b, and citizen science data will contribute to reporting an SDG indicator and help shape policies and national strategies. It shows other countries and global data and statistics communities how citizen science data can be used officially for SDG monitoring. So a lot of words in there. I really encourage you to just click through the story map. It's a pretty fascinating case study. I'm going to switch now to Citizen Science Month because I can't resist. It's April. It's Citizen Science Month. This is a global event. It's a global celebration of all things related to citizen science. Congratulations to all of you who have been working in citizen science, studying citizen science, activating citizen science, and to all the millions of people out there who volunteer their time to help accelerate research through citizen science. A little plug here for the success of last year's, and this year seems even bigger. So hundreds of events, 350,000 data contributions to projects. This is in addition to a lot of data analysis that was also done. That's the other type of citizen science that happens. When there's data gaps, scientists and project leaders invite the public to fill those data gaps by making and sharing observations. Sometimes people have way too much data and they ask people to sift through it and analyze it. And so just in the data observation category, 350,000 data contributions to projects is a lot. 2/3 of people who were surveyed said it changed the way they think about libraries when they got involved in Citizen Science Month. And that's because libraries are huge conduits to citizen science here in the United States. They are becoming community hubs for citizen science, which is great. And we had more than 1 million people reach through social media. So I'm just going to repeat something that I said in the beginning. Why am I telling you all of this about citizen science and SciStarter and our research companions and Citizen Science Month and so forth? That is because all of these combined efforts are increasing the amount and the quality of the reliable, current, and consistent data that's critical for achieving the SDGs. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And please feel free to reach out anytime, darlene@scistarter.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Cavalier. And yes, happy Easter and happy Citizen Science Month to everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the ASEAN University Network on Ecological Education and Culture, AUN-EEC, workshop on citizen science for addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in Southeast Asia. We're broadcasting from Manila, 9:30 a.m. this Easter Monday morning. Again, thank you to Professor Cavalier for showing us the many possibilities for citizen science, ranging from active exploration in the field to passive data processing right from the comfort of your desk. There really are many ways to get science into our lives, to participate in science and share the joy of discovery, no matter our age and location. And every move we make matters in achieving our sustainable development goals. Let's now look at how the ASEAN works with citizen science through our second keynote. Today, we will have two presenters for this keynote, Mr. Mendel Wong and Dr. Rachel Pateman. Mendel Wong is the Citizen Science Asia co-founder and co-chair. The community and the organization were established in response to the lack of a unified voice for Asia in matters relating to citizen science. Its goal is to bring together the regional citizen science community and help share their stories. Mendel is an active representative for Asia on the interim board for the Global Citizen Science Partnership. Its mission is to coordinate efforts to drive global citizen science-driven solutions and initiatives in conjunction with the United Nations Environmental Program and UN-affiliated agencies. Outside of citizen science contributions, Mendel's passion is to facilitate solutions that can leave a strong, positive experience for those involved. Rachel Pateman is a research fellow at the York Center of the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is based in the Department of Environment and Geography in the University of York in the United Kingdom. Her background is in ecology, but for the past nearly 10 years, she has been designing, running, and evaluating citizen science projects on a range of topics related to sustainability, including waste management, biodiversity conservation, and the bioeconomy. Dr. Pateman also carries out research into citizen science methodologies, with a particular focus on increasing diversity in citizen science participation. We now call on Mr. Mendel Wong and Dr. Pateman. The floor is yours for the second keynote.
Thank you. So yeah, first off, happy Citizen Science Month. Hopefully everyone's now getting involved. If you didn't know what it was, I'm glad you're able to join this call to understand a little bit more, especially in context to the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to thank AUN-EEC for the opportunity to have this chat with everyone, especially to Zita, who I've sort of been interacting with over the last few years with her and Afan's work in the region. So it's been amazing to see what they've been doing through the universities and through the community. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak with this group. So as been introduced, I am the co-founder of citizenscience.asia. And I'm going to give you a little chat about what we've been doing with respect to citizen science, with a bit of context in terms of Asia, but more so in terms of what's been done in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that already. And then, as been said, Rachel has also provided a pre-recording, given she's based in the UK. So same reason, it's also Easter weekend and it's very early in the day for them. So we do have a recording from her as well to go into a little bit more detail around some of the technical aspects as she's been researching with her fellows at the Stockholm Institute, Environmental Institute. So first off, I'm just going to go into from an Asia perspective and sort of the history of what we've been doing from a global perspective. As been said, I'm the co-founder of citizenscience.asia. I'm also a member of the interim board for the Global Citizen Science Partnership. And finally, I've had the opportunity to be on the external board as an advisor for CS Track, a European Union project, which is actually trying to measure and track CS progress, citizen science progress in itself. So it's quite meta in terms of what it's been doing. So it's a 5-year program, and I think they're through the third year now. So I guess before I get into some of the more details with respect to citizen science and its journey in this space, I'm just going to sort of establish some sort of basics. So hopefully most people already know this, but it is sort of confusing in terms of the numbers that are out there. So I just want to summarize. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure everyone's seen these icons a number of times by now. They're meant to cover a wide spectrum of items that nations around the world are trying to develop towards by 2030. To get measurable and sort of concrete progress, there are 169 targets that have been set across these 17 development goals. And specifically in terms of how these are measured, as far as the targets are concerned, there are 244 indicators, which 231 are unique, meaning some of the indicators do repeat in different targets for SDGs, given sort of the commonality between them. Another aspect I just want to sort of highlight as background, just to give context to the importance of citizen science in the context of the SDGs. So the UN World Data Forum, which is a conference which happened biannually, I guess COVID aside, is meant to bring together the data and statistical experts and the users to spur data innovation, mobilize high-level political and financial support for data, and to build a pathway to better data for sustainable development. It came about as a tool to help manage the amount of data that has come out of the analysis towards the SDGs. So most recently, there has been a forum in Bern, Switzerland, back in 2021. I think it was in October. So just to highlight on screen here, you'll see there have been 6 thematic areas that were defined for the conference. And all the talks and sessions were sort of evolved around these 6 points. So just really quickly, just to highlight some of the key points there. The idea is that they're trying to understand new approaches to capacity development for better data, how you support broad data ecosystems in countries. Second one, innovations and synergies across data ecosystems, bringing the data sources together and creating an enabling environment for the integration and use of non-traditional data sources. Third one, leaving no one behind. Obviously, that's quite common across the SDGs as you see them. The idea being to generate and leverage data and statistics to ensure visibility and voice for everyone. D, understanding the world through data, making sure data and statistics are relevant and usable to the users, ensuring there's data and statistical literacy increase, and also in terms of data communication, strengthening the use of data in journalistic literacies. An important idea is building trust in data and statistics, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. Applying data principles and governance to new and existing data sources to implement open data principles and practices. And finally, as a progress measure, how far have we come? The first UN World Data Forum started in Cape Town. And so this is a progress to see how far it's come along in the implementation since then, to understand the emerging challenges of fully harnessing the power of data to improve people's lives. So it's probably hard to see on the screen there, but there are a few keywords I've bolded there. But just to summarize, effectively, the whole World Data Forum, the viewpoint of this a few years on is really that it's really important that the data ecosystem, the relevancy and the trust are all very critical as a basis for society and communities to get behind the policy decisions and solutions that come about with the SDGs. So citizen science activities and its output in terms of its data work exactly in this context and help provide a lot of the transparency and relevancy, especially when projects are created appropriately in a fashion of co-creation, and also an idea of that because they're so localized with the communities as a very localized scope, which help to fill those gaps, which is very different from the National Statistic Office, which come top down. So there's a bottom-up approach to help fill those gaps. So this is just sort of to set the stage for why citizen science is so relevant and so important with respect to the SDGs as far as the data is concerned. So just taking a step back again, people being on this call, hopefully you already have an idea what citizen science might be, but obviously it is a lot of different things, a lot of different people. For ourselves in Asia, one of the things we did early on was also just to figure out what's the definition of citizen science for us. But what I'm going to use here for the context of this talk is really the definition that's been defined as part of the global delegation that had was at the UN Environment Assembly back in 2017. So just to read that out as part of the statement that was provided at the time, professional science alone cannot provide information, the scales and resolutions necessary to understand environmental change. The dominant culture of scientific expertise does not account for different ways of knowing and often fails to engage the public. So citizen science emphasizes collaborative intelligence and co-creation to facilitate scientific and community-based solutions. To transform, or it should become the bread and butter for environmental research and policy. To transform science, there is a realistic target to engage 1 billion global citizens by 2020. So this is obviously a few years ago, and it's been a few years since. I think we've hit that point at this, as far as data points are concerned. I think some of the metrics around the number of citizen science is obviously a vague number. As I mentioned with CS Track, that's some of the work that you're trying to do just to get better metrics and traction around that. But again, this is sort of the one viewpoint of citizen science in the context of SDGs, which become relevant as I go through the deck today. Obviously, there's a lot of few common terms that you hear over and over again with respect to the collaborative, the co-creation, sort of the solution finding, and obviously community-based in general. So just to hone in a little bit on Asia, obviously Darlene's talked a lot about what they've been doing over in the Americas. Obviously, they've provided some solutions with across from an international scope. So obviously it's a great target for us in Asia where we might get to. But just sort of to talk a little bit about Asia and why it's really important for us as everyone on this call would understand and appreciate. So if you didn't appreciate or know already, there's actually been a long history of citizen science in practice already in Asia, starting way back when the Japanese people were tracking cherry blossoms. Every year, every season, they would track the blossoming timeframes, the weather, the climates relating to that. So if you understand citizen science, that is a form of observations from a research scientific perspective, that is effectively citizen science. Now, it may not be known as that for all this time. So as far as a concept is concerned, since it's come back on vogue over the last 10 years or so, it is still relatively unknown if you sort of talk to people in Asia. So it is something that needs to be opened up. And that is really important because, as we all know, Asia has over 50 countries and accounts for nearly 60% of the world's population, but it is massively underrepresented in global conversations. With a lot of the huge challenges in this space due to climate change, pollution, loss of biodiversity, it's super, super critical to include Asia in all of these dialogues, especially from an international strategic a standardization standpoint, just to embrace the high diversity that we obviously have here. So to summarize, there is a high need to engage, develop, and coordinate Asia alongside other international counterparts in the citizen science movement, in short. And I guess this sort of brings me to how citizenscience.asia came about. As was introduced in terms of the reason for its introduction, we were founded in 2017 off the back of a workshop that we were doing as Scott Edmonds and myself was working on a project to do with mosquitoes and how to sort of understand the threat of that during the Zika scare. So we were invited to this workshop that was hosted by UN Environment along with the Wilson Center and the European Citizen Science Association. The idea is they wanted to figure out, is there a global solution that takes into account local deployment in the form of citizen science to see how that could tackle the problem at hand, which is obviously a health and environmental concern. So this is back in 2017. Off the back of that, I was at the workshop. And as I sat around the room at the table, I was literally the only person from Asia there. And to be honest, it's pure serendipity how we got there. And it is a bit unfortunate to not really see more representation, both because there's obviously many communities within Asia, but obviously mosquito as a subject was not unique to Hong Kong, which is where I'm from. So it is very disappointing to see. So at that point, it was sort of a mission that I've sort of found for myself, and I got Scott involved. Really, we wanted to just make sure there's a representation sitting at this table for Asia as a region amongst these discussions. So sort of long story short, over the last few years, we've been working with a lot of people, which we'll go into in the form of the global citizen science work, but we've registered as a charitable organization back in 2020. So we are now a formal entity that is sort of at the point of getting accreditation with the UN as well to continue our work in that space from a top-down perspective. So what we believe in is that everyone should have the opportunity to contribute to knowledge discovery and affect positive changes in our world through citizen science. That's a short summary of why we're sort of around. And in order to do this, our mission is to build a grassroots community, sustainable capacity, and tangible conversations in Asia to support this vision. So I won't go too long in terms of the details of what we do. There's something we can talk offline. Feel free to reach out to me. But I'll sort of blitz through these three aspects just for some context in terms of what we're doing. And it sort of comes into the picture for some of the discussion later on in the slides. So it's quite a busy 3 slides in terms of these 3 aspects we're focusing on, but just really in short, from a community building standpoint, is really to facilitate the dialogues amongst the practitioners who are already involved with citizen science and their projects across Asia and with the rest of the world. But at the same time, we're obviously grassroots level, just trying to reach out to the general public to advocate and provide exposure and gain traction in the understanding of what citizen science is. Some of the challenges really are in the diversity of the language, the culture, socioeconomics. So there isn't really a consistent approach that applies like you might do in the Americas or with the European Union. And this obviously, I think everyone fully appreciates. So how do we communicate? How to represent data? How do we even have the same amount of priority and time from people to get involved? And one of the things we're doing is obviously having a pillar around the community. So there's something that we're trying to grow and is something you can join. Some of the activities we're trying to do is just really find local contact points, inventory some of the projects that are in the region, interview citizen science to give exposure, and also just publish some of the stories on an online journal, which Dita had kindly shared the link for already in the chat. With respect to capacity building, I think that's a very common term in this space. And what our definition really is around developing a better baseline for people's understanding of what citizen science is. Therefore, people have the capability to be able to participate and contribute. So it's to encourage the sharing of open data for public consumption and analysis. It's to facilitate the shared experience, knowledge, and resource to advance research process and best practices. So from an academic institution standpoint, I don't think this is anything new. This is what traditionally these places already do. So the idea here is to encourage and to educate and to sort of really empower the general community that this is something that everyone can help participate. And as a byproduct of this, it really helps with the scientific communication to really open up to the layman terms so people understand what's going on. And this is obviously very, very important. Back to the point I mentioned around the World Data Forum's objectives, it really gives relevancy and transparency and trust to the data, because you need people to understand what they're working on. You need people to touch and feel the actual data for them to sort of feel personal relevancy to why it's being done. Obviously, some of the challenges is sort of cultural. I'm speaking sort of more from a Chinese, Japanese sort of context, but I think in general it's quite true. It's a history of really top-down approaches to the solutions. Most of society usually look to sort of the government for directions, and no one really wants to stick out. Obviously, this is changing with some of the environmental justice, social justice aspects, as the top is not really reliable in that sense. The other aspect is sort of a general more passiveness in terms of the culture of success doesn't include failures. So that's something to be educated as we open up and iterate over failures. And it's okay for people to step out of their comfort zones and get involved, even in small bits, to help with the contribution. And in this space in general is obviously an education pillar we're working on, which is really to interact with schools, open up opportunities. One of the main things we want to get to some degree, very similar to what SciStar has already done as a great job, is really having a network between practitioners or possible practitioners and project leaders who are looking for volunteers. And in this context of education is really trying to get to a point where citizen science project organizers maybe provide the material in such a way so that they can be like educational toolkits for schools and educational institutes to be able to pick up. So it's sort of a win-win for both sides in terms of content generation, but also participation from students and any age groups across the community, really. Finally, is from a conversations building standpoint, is really just to encourage dialogues between East and the West, North and the South, but more importantly is really also the practitioners, the generalist communities, with the governments, the policymakers, with the national statistic offices. And also another idea is really trying to decouple problem definition and solution implementation, because the idea for regular citizens or communities to contribute towards SDGs might seem quite daunting in the sense that how could any one individual or even small group of people contribute to something as vast as the SDGs? But the idea here is that if you decouple the two, really is around citizen science at foremost help to define the problem. So as a measure based on data in sort of this day and age, it's really trying to find metrics around what the environment is doing, how these problems are coming about. You need to be able to measure these things first. And even if you're not even addressing the solution yet, the problem definition is something that citizen science can obviously contribute a lot towards. And that is where obviously a lot of the community can help with in terms of providing structured observations that define the problem. Therefore, the solutions can be adapted and more relevant to what the actual issue is in a localized fashion. And obviously, the other aspect from a conversation standpoint is really the partner on the solution design based on what I just mentioned. So some of this is just in terms of, again, lack of public awareness and literacy around science, lack of understanding, experience, skill set to accept data from non-government source of processing. So there's a lot of learning as well from the government standpoint, because there's a trust and there's a capacity to be able to deal with all this additional data that might be coming in. And until sort of there's sanitation and quality checks, there's also that question around how do you sort of sift through the data points to get rid of all the outliers. And finally, obviously in the Asia region, a low availability resources is a common theme. So partnerships pillar is a little bit sort of newer in terms of where we are in the cycle, but it is really trying to figure out partners both at a global top-down level, which we're already doing with the Global Citizen Science Partnership in the UN environment, but also locally across the board. And it's working with communities like yourself and trying to understand at a local level who are the right people that needs to be having conversations with to move this forward. So that brings me forward to sort of what's at a global level, what's a Global Citizen Science Partnership about, what they're doing. They were founded in 2017 at the inaugural UN Science Policy Business Forum. This is a forum that was created by the UN Environment leading up to the third UN Environment Assembly. The idea being to engage the private sectors along with the policymakers and the scientists and sort of the non-governmental organizations in general. So we, off the back of the mosquito workshop I mentioned earlier, UN Environment had invited us as a group to represent sort of the citizen science group as a global delegation. So we sort of hopped on that opportunity and made a statement during this session about the formation of the global partnership, which is really to act as a network of the citizen science networks across the board, along with other sectors who might be involved in the space, really to sort of coordinate the local and global initiatives and be a single point of contact for the UN Environment and other UN affiliates to ramp up the citizen science effort. So it's been a few years on. We're in the process of being registered formally as a legal entity. There's been work being done as a loose group of volunteers over the period of this time. So it's been amazing how much it's been sort of being accomplished during this period. But we are now in the process of moving it forward as a legal entity for more formalized work. And this hosting and secretary role will be supported by ISA, which I will talk about in a little bit further. And they're taking over from the Wilson Center, which I mentioned earlier on at the outset of the formation of this group. So one of the key objectives for the formation, as mentioned, given it was driven by the UN Environment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is obviously to advance the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is through coordinated advocacy of citizen science initiatives. One of the subgroups or projects that came out of it is really the SDGs CS maximization group. So this was an ongoing exercise for 2-3 years. It's sort of on pause at the moment because of the lack of additional resource to take it further. But the idea was really obviously to maximize the citizen science contribution to and benefit from the UN 2030 agenda and its associated SDGs. So the short-term goals at the time were to identify where and how citizen science can add value to the SDGs, and also to identify opportunities for citizen science methodology to be acknowledged as a provider of citizens-generated data. So these things now, given this is sort of a few years out now, it's kind of obvious to most people. But at the time, this was obviously something that was relatively new, have to put it on people's radars. Some of the other medium and long-term goals I've listed here as well is sort of a follow-on that needs to be achieved. And these are obviously ongoing exercise and sort of organically happening until there's sort of more resource put towards this. But we're now getting to that point. There's a lot of distributed efforts towards these. So this is like building the momentum for the community, supporting and for the contributing organizations, projects, or platforms, the facilitation of interoperability, and also sort of sharing best practices and principles. And I'm going to go through some of the other key players globally over the last few years to highlight how these things have been done and how they sort of contribute towards the SDG specifically. One of the landmark output of this group, or along with other people over those first year and a bit, 18 months or so, is this article that was published in Nature magazine back in October 2019. And if you have looked up or done any research on citizen science, especially in context of SDGs, this would have undoubtedly come up, because this was an amazing achievement by a lot of contributors across the international community to discuss how and where citizen science really apply as far as SDGs are concerned. So this was an effort that happened across multiple workshops and events. Where possible, people would come together, have workshops and discuss it, and offline from there, it would also be discussed further. And this effort was really led by IESA, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll touch on it a little bit more. But in short, the idea is that, as you can see in the bottom right diagram here, it might be a little bit small, but generally the idea being, traditionally, as we started this whole SDG effort, a lot of it was dependent on top-down information in terms of data that might already been gathered by national statistic offices. And from there, they had to figure out how do you grow that to meet the indicators and targets. And that is where obviously there's been a lot of holes and challenges figuring out what is the standardization around that process. So non-traditional data has come up as a term more often than not. And some of these include things like things that are potentially done in the commercial space in terms of like mobile phone records, commercial data. It might be from sensors, it might be from satellite images, it might be from spatial localized data based on GPS, and finally, obviously, citizens generated data. So some of these might have already been in play, and it's more about incorporating them into the framework. For example, you might get data from air pollution monitoring stations used by the WHO. And these have contributed to things like indicator 11.6.2, which is the annual mean levels of fine particulate matter, the PM 2.5 and PM 10. Obviously, I think a lot of us in Asia are very familiar with. It also then feeds into indicator 391, which is the mortality rates attributed to household and ambient air pollution. The other aspect is from Earth observation, which has been a huge step forward, given sort of the technology we have now. So coupling that with sort of the citizen science effort in terms of sifting through some of these satellite images, that has lent itself greatly in terms of the improvement of covering some of these spaces, which I'll go into more. So obviously citizen science data, which is one of those non-traditional data, has been defined as super important. And the way it's been characterized, like traditional data, is in 5 dimensions. And this is something that Rachel will go into a little bit more during her presentation, so I'll leave that with her portion. So pausing there for a second, let's take a look back at some of the key players involved and what's been happening through this journey. So as I mentioned, UNEP, which is the Environment Program, along with its UN Environment Assembly and the Science Policy Business Forum, which I've touched on already, this is something that they were well aware of early on in the challenge that they're going to be coming up with to meet the SDGs with respect to the indicators and the data sets that are available to understand that. Gillian Campbell, one of the leading statisticians looking after this work in terms of monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals, here's a quote from her. "We're currently almost 5 years into 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, yet we do not have sufficient data for tracking the environment dimensions of Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, we have insufficient data for tracking goal progress for 68% of the environment-related Sustainable Development Goal indicators. We'll never be able to monitor the environmental dimension of the goals using traditional data sources alone. Data generated by citizens, bracket citizen science, has tremendous potential for helping us monitor the goals. Engaging citizens in the data collection process improves community awareness and action." I don't think that's any surprise with us now, a couple years on from sort of this quote. And obviously that leads us to where we are now here. One thing to point out there is no objective definition in terms of the SDG indicators, which are strictly environmental. So just for context, as an interpretation, and just as an initial attempt, these are identified to be relating to environmental policy, environmental state or trends, sustainable consumption and production, and natural resource use, or interactions between people and the environment, just for context. And an additional part of that, so out of these number of indicators, so the UN Environment is actually a custody agency for 26 of these. So they have a hugely vested interest in figuring out what's the solution to these data gaps. And so that is the trigger for its support of the Global Citizen Science Partnership and the citizen science effort through the Environment Assembly and the Science Policy Business Forum that they have put together. So they continue to be a critical partner for us as a global partnership, and sort of a key way into some of the other UN organizations as well. So just to give context, this effort is supported top down very critical core to the whole effort of SDGs. So this is not something sort of peripheral people have been trying to push into the agenda. This is something very centrally accepted. It's more about bringing everyone else on board from a national standpoint in terms of policymakers. As I touched on a couple of times, I mentioned IASA. So what is it? Who are they? They're the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. They have done amazing work over the last few years as this effort had been ramped up. So just for context, they're an independent international research institute that's based in Austria. So they have member organizations in Africa, Americas, Asia, and Europe. So they're pretty much distributed around the world. And what they do is through their research programs initiatives, they're conducting policy-oriented research into issues that are too large or complex to be solved by a single country or academic discipline. So with that focus, they've really taken a lead on a lot of research papers and work groups throughout the events on this subject. So a lot of the papers and events I touch on here all are led in some ways by ISA in a large degree. So this is just a key player in this context. If you're curious who is doing some of this stuff, who might be a good contact, who might be a good resource to understand what's being done. So just to move along, one of the key projects that was launched, and it's now closed, it ran for 3 years between 2017 and 2020. It really had a European slant to this, as it was funded by the EU under the H2020 Research and Innovation Program. So massive amount of money, fortunately, was invested into this program. And the project we observed was aimed to move the citizen science into mainstream by building a sustainable ecosystem of citizens observatories and related activities. So just to make clear here, the idea of the scope of what they were doing here was really to focus around citizens observatories. And that's after discussion with the people who were involved, were really a subset of, rather than the citizen science at large. So it is a subset of, so this does not include necessarily citizens being involved in the research analysis or modeling aspects of the scientific cycle, but really on the observatories as a isolated portion of it. What they've done as an overall project early on in the first couple of years is really launch 4 communities of practices. And community of practices, I think, is something that's super critical as we go forward. And I think it's something really, really important in Asia we need to sort of do more of, because there isn't really a core group growing out of Asia doing some of this stuff. For the most part, it's just individuals joining sort of global community, which is important because you want that dialogue. But I think there's a lot of unique challenges in Asia that needs to be understood. So anyways, communities of practice, I think is a term that's ongoing that we should continue to look at and come up with the right groups. But for what they did is they came up with 4 communities of practices in the space of engagement, making impact, interoperability, and the SDG. So obviously for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to focus on that last COP that was launched in 2018. So the objective of that community of practice, and the objectives was really co-created by its participants. So that's how democratic or open and sort of relevant to people who are working on this. It's really come up by the people who are passionate about the subject. So the idea were to understand the opportunities and challenges for the use of data from a citizen science observatories for SDG monitoring, and also to advance the knowledge of how citizen science observatories can help behavior change towards achieving the SDGs. So just for context, a huge number of things were looked at, obviously, and it dwindled down to these 2 being the main focus in its limited scope and budget during that time frame. And you'll see as I get through the rest of the slides here, there were a number of things that came out of this that were very unique and interesting, and I think very helpful in this context for us to sort of look at as reference. So one of them was a second landmark output, which is Darlene's actually already referenced, is this article that was published in Sustainability Science back in July 2020. So it presented an overview of where citizen science is already contributing and could contribute data to the SDG indicator for IMWORK. So I won't go through again some of the things that Darlene had already mentioned, but I'll just add on a few other things that were notable that came out of that research paper. So as she had already mentioned, between the stuff that we're already contributing and could contribute, obviously it brings a total of 33% of the indicators. So that's quite a bit where citizen science can be contributing towards. And as Darlene already mentioned, the greatest inputs were really in the SDGs 15, 11, 30, and 6, as she talked about. but really has the potential to contribute to all 17 SDGs. And this is an important aspect, which I failed to mention a little bit earlier on. As one of the early conversations of the global partnership, as we started embarking on the conversation around how do we focus our efforts on SDGs, it was a great debate on, are we looking and limiting our scope to really what's in the environment, natural world space, which is obviously the obvious things that citizen science could contribute towards, things that you can feel and touch and sort of observe in nature. But one of the things we agreed on was citizen science was actually much more flexible to that, depending on the use case and the application and implementation, and really is contributive to all 17 SDGs. So as part of this research paper, it really echoed and confirmed that aspect. And the reason they were able to do that, as Darlene mentioned, in terms of what they did with this paper, is really trying to map existing initiatives and activities to the SDG indicators. And they were able to find stories and initiatives which really map to them, either directly or indirectly affecting or improving the data set that could be contributed to the indicators. Another aspect which I kind of touched on already, and these are obviously concrete aspects that were discovered, hence the interesting point around it. 24 of these indicators actually have overlap between the citizen science and the Earth observations. And these data sets contribution can greatly complement each other, as I sort of mentioned early on, in terms of, aside from AI driven photography and data sets, really having citizens apply an extra layer of judicial and analysis to make that fine-grained decision and improve the data quality. One thing that's very interesting and important for us to note in Asia especially is the list of initiatives is not exhaustive in terms of what they were doing for their mapping. Initiatives meaning the citizen science projects and activities. As these are predominantly English-based, and as Darlene had mentioned, SciStarter was obviously a great source of some of the potential projects that could be used. So as far as we observe is concerned, they were only really looking for at least one example to match up with the indicators. So the idea was not to have an exhaustive list of projects. So that is something that's actually still a bit wanting from our perspective to understand who's doing good work here, who we can leverage or reference, but also more importantly, is just as an example and also just as a sense of pride to some degree to contribute towards these indicators. The other aspect that came up was just the countries in Asia and Africa, on average, have data available to monitor only about 20% of the SDG indicators. So I don't think that's necessarily surprising, given sort of resource and sort of the amount of collaboration and consolidated effort. So this is something that's obviously important for us to know and hopefully improve on. And as we already mentioned, from a UN perspective, or UN environment perspective, 68% of those environmental SDG indicators lack data. And within that, 59% of that 68% can be supported by citizen science, just as a smaller subset, and to focus on that whole natural world observation aspect I mentioned. Promise the last few slides here. I know we're way over time, but another output of We Observe that was quite unique, I think, is this idea of a We Observe cookbook. As you can see on the screenshot here, it really is a walkthrough sort of wizard or guide, taking you through an understanding of what you might need to sort of do an action and understand or think about, depending on your goal. So I pulled out an example for how do we link the citizens' observations from SDG perspective. So as you walk through the steps to this cookbook, these are some of the points that were sort of raised. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but the idea is that people, the project group had taken time from multiple sources and sort of boiled it down to a number of predetermined steps. That is a great way to start some of your project or effort. So this is an amazing resource to leverage, and obviously provide some of these links offline after the fact. But if you look up We Observe Cookbook, it's pretty easy to find. But obviously it's quite detailed and a number of bullet points for you to do there. It's not like just 2 points, oh, do this or do that. It's just a lot of very diligent thoughts in how you can approach the exercise. Another group that was doing amazing work in part towards some of these SDGs from the context of templates or guides. So the Committee on Data of the International Science Council, or in short, CODATA. So they do a number of things in international scientific research space. So they promote global collaboration to improve availability and usability of data for all areas of research. And they strive to advance the interoperability and usability such that research data should be intelligently open or fair, which is an acronym we can look up, leading to open science. So one of the subgroups efforts in the space of citizen science with respect to SDGs is really trying to, again, boil down some of the technical aspects, which can be quite complicated if you try to understand the number of indicators and how do you match your citizen science project objectives to these to see if it's really measurable and applicable. So what they've done is set up a few guides to help translate some of these data and indicators that are required by UN and national governments, so that you can sort of match up how do you then generate the appropriate research data output, so that you can actually put this forth as a possible data source. So they didn't go through and do it for all indicators, obviously quite a few, as Darlene mentioned. So a few specific guides were prepared. I haven't listed here, but you can always find it online as well. It's really towards the ones that we found to be the highest correlation. So in SDG 3, for the good health and well-being, the indicator 3.1 maternal mortality ratio. For SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, 11.6.1 is the proportion of municipal solid waste collected and managed in controlled facilities out of total municipal waste generated by cities. SDG 15 is life on land, which is the indicator 15.5.1 of the Red List Index. SDG 13, climate action, which is an obvious one, indicator 13.1.2, number of countries that adopt and implement national disaster risk reduction strategy in line with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction 2015-2030. So it's not a lot, but it's a good start. If you're working in these spaces towards these indicators, which might be quite common in the space of environment, they have specifically provided some how-to guides really just to understand what is it exactly that is required for these indicators. So this brings me to a close. So what's really the call to action, I guess, for us? I guess one thing I obviously was not able to do and wish I could have, and it's something I think the group was looking to. Obviously, we have the 4 workshop in parallel, which talk to some of the citizen science projects we're doing in Asia towards this space. So one thing I found, and it's sort of confirmed again, doing another due diligence for this workshop, is really there are really not a whole lot of examples in Asia. Where there are some, it's usually part of a global project with some aspects, whether there's people on the ground in Asia or some tools was applicable. But there really are not enough examples in Asia, or at least not well known. So that is something that citizenscience.asia and I'm personally passionate to sort of want to understand and get mapped out there. And hopefully with your help across the different sort of chapters within the region, this is something we can sort of put together as an inventory. There's really a need to map project objectives with those of the SDG indicators, as I mentioned, from a technicality standpoint, from a success standpoint. So it's possible for people to sort of map the success of their citizen science projects with the massive outcome at the end. Is really how do you ensure that the output is congruent with the acceptable data that's required for SDG reporting. And I'm going to jump forward to the last point there. And part of this really does involve having those dialogues between the communities and policymakers and statistician offices to align those possibilities. So there's an understanding of what is the work that's being done that might be close to home and very relevant for the local community, and how we can arrange those projects in such a way, co-created again, so that the generated output really matches up with what's required. Therefore, you sort of have a symbiosis win-win situation where top down, the policymakers, the national office is wanting to make sure these projects are successful and potentially take it to scale is obviously an important point. And the other 2 points to fill in there, which sort of align with some of our mission, is really just to continue to educate the community and project leaders with the vast number of ways that everyone can help contribute to both painting a clearer picture of the problems, but also potentially on the solutions associated with SDGs. And finally, just to continue simplifying the process of project creation with guides, toolkits, platforms, and best practices, as some of these notable groups have been doing over the last couple of years from a global standpoint. But the key point here is in Asia, it's still severely lacking in that space. We can look to the West, the North for some of this stuff. But one challenge is obviously from a language standpoint, accessibility. So this is something that I think I'd like to call upon people in this group as you look at these exercises, really using projects you might come up with as template, but from my perspective, helping work with you guys to sort of pull in resources from around the world so we can understand how do we leverage that better and localize it for our purpose. I encourage you to take a look at this this map. I believe Darlene also referenced this. This is a great summary of some of the stuff I mentioned. Again, it's led by Delek Prezo of IESA. It's a great sort of web-based presentation, slide presentation of some of the things that's been done and it's been ongoing as a summary. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And of course, feel free to email me directly for any questions you might have. And just a few plugs for things. We are launching a new website this week, so have a look at our website's latest updates, www.citizenscience.asia. You can join the community at join.citizenscience.asia. And finally, we have a top 10 fact sheet that you can have a look at as a good summary. All right. And with that, I'm going to go straight into Rachel's presentation and have her go through some of the details, especially in context to low and middle income cities. And she does a great job, given her background experience and tenure in this space, to go through some of the technical applications of these indicators and how they apply to low and middle income cities, which is obviously very applicable in this region.
Hi, thanks so much for the invitation to talk at this conference today. My name is Rachel Pateman and I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute. I'm based in our office at the University of York in the UK, where we've got a team of people who've been working on citizen science for nearly 15 years now. Today, I'm going to be talking about how citizen science has the potential to contribute towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So the topic of how citizen science can be used in the context of the SDGs is growing in momentum. As I'm sure you're all aware, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all UN member states in 2015. At the heart of this are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which aim to end poverty and other deprivations, improve health and education, reduce inequality and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and preserving marine and terrestrial biodiversity. The 17 goals are underpinned by 169 targets, which set out a series of outcomes and means of implementation for the goals. Each of these targets has a number of indicators by which progress will be measured, of which there are 247 in total. So, how can citizen science be used within the context of the SDGs? First of all, much of the discussion has been around how citizen science could contribute to collecting data needed to monitor SDG indicators, as it's widely recognised that there are currently significant gaps in the data that are available. Only 35 of the 169 targets have sufficient data globally for progress to be tracked. There are particular concerns that data underrepresent certain sectors of society, often the already marginalised, such as those living in informal settlements. Or they may have poor geographic coverage, missing out data from harder to reach places. And they may not be up to date. Official surveys are often expensive to run and so are only repeated infrequently, particularly in lower income countries. Citizen science has been proposed as one way in which these data gaps could be filled. It's been proven as a method to collect data from marginalised communities, and it can be used to collect data from wide geographic areas, including harder to reach places. And it can generate data at very fine temporal resolutions and be responsive so that data are up to date. While indicator monitoring is done at the national level, there's also a drive to localise the SDGs to cities and regions. This is the process of taking into account subnational contexts in the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. Reporting at the national level risks losing the vast variation that exists within countries. Local monitoring, which citizen science is well placed to contribute to, can capture this variation, including from marginalised communities in commonly underreported areas. This can help to achieve the pledge of the UN member states to leave no one behind. Citizen science methods, particularly in co-created type projects where citizens are involved in the design of research, can help bring to the fore issues of importance or concern to local communities that may have been missed in higher level discussions. Citizen science therefore also offers the opportunity to identify new, locally relevant targets and indicators to fill gaps in the existing SDG framework, And this is something that we discussed in this discussion brief that Sarah West and I published a few years ago now on how citizen science could support the SDGs. Finally, there's also huge scope for citizen science to contribute to actually achieving the SDGs in a number of ways. The research and monitoring that's done through citizen science projects can help to advance the understanding of environmental and social problems, and which can then be addressed through scientific advances, technological developments, policy making, and local action. Citizen science also has the potential to influence the individuals and communities that participate in projects. The need to engage citizens in the SDGs in order for them to be achieved has been recognised since their formation, and citizen science has the potential to provide a platform for this engagement. For example, through participation, citizens can gain knowledge and awareness of sustainability issues, which is itself one of the SDG targets. Through this participation, citizens may also change their behaviour and influence others to do the same. Citizen science can also be a way to bring together different stakeholders, including citizens, to build shared understanding of and co-develop solutions to sustainability challenges. Partnership working is also recognised as being critical for the achievement of the SDGs and has a dedicated goal, number 17, Partnership for the Goals. So clearly there are a lot of opportunities, but there are also challenges for the use of citizen science within the SDGs too, such as data quality and who is not participating and represented in the data collected. At SCI, we recently completed a review of current and existing citizen science projects to understand in more detail what these opportunities and challenges are. The focus of this review was citizen science in urban environments in low and middle income countries. More than half of the world's population live in urban areas, and this is projected to increase to 2/3 by 2050. The SDGs have a dedicated goal focused on tackling sustainability in urban environments, SDG 11, which aims to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. This recognises the pressure on man-made and natural systems that come from rapidly growing populations, but also that cities have the potential to be where critical successes for sustainability can be achieved. Cities have been at the centre of a lot of the recent discussion in citizen science approaches. The smart cities concept, for example, aims to make use of smartphones and other low-cost sensors, as well as social media and other big data to monitor the city environment and inform urban management. However, the digitally invisible will not be represented in these data, and this is likely to be more acute in lower middle-income countries. Solutions to sustainability challenges need to be designed with the needs of a wide cross-section of the population in mind to avoid benefiting only a minority. So in our review, we searched the academic and non-academic literature for reports of citizen science projects that have taken place or are still ongoing in urban environments in low and middle income countries. From this, we identified 139 relevant projects. We then used the dimensions of citizen science described in this paper by Fritz and colleagues in Nature Sustainability. These describe the features of citizen science data and their value for the SDGs. We assessed our suite of projects against these values to assess the extent to which citizen science is fulfilling its potential and to identify challenges that need to be addressed for this to happen. When doing this, we considered citizen science for both implementing and achieving, as well as monitoring the SDGs. We also carried out a series of interviews with practitioners to provide further detail. So the first dimension of citizen science data described by Fritz and colleagues is that of the geographic dimension. Here we found that all our projects generated data with a spatial reference, so fulfilling the value of citizen science to contribute to spatially explicit indicators. Another value of citizen science data under this dimension is that it can provide denser data coverage than traditional surveys. We found this difficult to test with our data, but we did find this frequently mentioned as a motivation for using citizen science projects. We also found that projects were running from neighbourhood to global scales, showing the potential for citizen science to contribute to the SDGs at different scales, including localising the SDGs, but also monitoring at national and international scales. We did find, however, an uneven distribution of projects between countries. We found most projects in China, followed by Brazil, India, and Mexico. there were relatively fewer projects in low-income countries compared with middle-income countries. And this perhaps reflects some of the challenges of doing citizen science in particularly resource-poor regions. The next dimension is the temporal dimension, and this discusses the value of citizen science being that it generates data at a finer temporal resolution than traditional surveys, which might only occur once every few years. We found that most projects collected data continuously rather than in regular cycles, showing the potential for citizen science to produce data at fine temporal resolutions and fill these gaps. The other value of citizen science discussed in this dimension is that of temporal duration, so that data are collected in the long term. We found, however, that many of the projects we identified were only trials rather than being fully implemented, and that the average duration of those projects that have been launched was only just over 3 years. Longevity of projects was recognised as a challenge by many project leaders, which is illustrated by this quote in one of the resources in our review, which says that the question of how to scale up and maintain these efforts at a city level. The scarcity of such cases might be well connected to limited resources, NGO experiences, and institutional gaps in making it possible to have a continuous programme over some years. The next dimension discussed by Fritz and colleagues is the thematic dimension. One of the values of this being the thematic breadth of citizen science, making it relevant to many of the SDGs. And our findings echo this, with projects being identified across a wide range of the SDGs. This includes some direct relevance to particular indicators, such as these shown here, showing the potential for citizen science to contribute to monitoring existing indicators. We also identified alignment with several SDGs through the co-benefits of citizen science, such as education for sustainable development, promotion of social, economic and political inclusion, inclusive decision-making and partnership building. These outcomes, however, were often seen as being aspirational rather than intentionally designed within projects, and there was a lack of evidence of these sort of outcomes actually being achieved. Also within the thematic dimension is the idea that citizen science could be used to identify and monitor topics of concern to citizens that are not currently covered within the SDG framework. And this was also reflected in our review. Many projects were aligned with goals, but not with any of their constituent targets or indicators, suggesting that these projects are focusing on topics not yet covered within the framework. The process dimension describes how data are collected and how citizens are engaged with projects. A key theme that emerged here was that while top-down projects designed and run by researchers and others are likely to have better opportunities for alignment with SDG monitoring requirements, the need to engage communities deeply within projects was also seen as crucial by project leaders. This was seen as being particularly important when working with the resource poor to make sure that methods are appropriate for and meet the needs of participants. This highlighted a tension between meeting the needs of communities within projects and also meeting top-down monitoring needs, and raised the question of whether these could both be achieved within projects. We also found that most of our projects only achieve people in the data collection process of the research cycle, and this was often passively rather than actively. So the co-benefits of citizen science for things like education, which are more likely to occur when citizens are deeply involved in projects, was identified as a missed opportunity within many projects. The final dimension is the data management dimension, which highlights the importance of data from projects being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable in order to maximize their value. We, however, found little evidence of projects adhering to these principles, or indeed a discussion of these issues, which highlighted a challenge with regards to maximising the use of citizen-generated data. So overall, this highlighted some key questions for us, which we think need to be addressed in order for citizen science to achieve its potential. So the first being, how can citizen science be supported in low-income countries? And what is the role for organisations such as the Global Citizen Science Partnership and other umbrella organisations to support this? Can community-led projects contribute to SDG monitoring, or should these actually be seen as separate goals? How can projects be designed to make the most of the potential co-benefits of citizen science approaches? And this includes thinking about how we can engage stakeholders who can use the data collected to inform their decision making. And finally, how can citizen science be embedded in the post-2030 agenda rather than the approach at the moment of retrofitting? Are there priority areas we should focus citizen science on in particular? Thanks very much for listening, and I'm sorry I can't be there to take any of your questions, and I hope you have a stimulating rest of the conference.
All right. Thank you so much to Mr. Wong and Dr. Pateman. And again, happy Easter and happy Citizen Science Month to everyone attending. Thank you for staying with us here in the AUN-EEC workshop on citizen science for addressing the UN Sustainable Development Goals in Southeast Asia. We're here in Manila, Easter Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. So thank you again to our keynote speakers for talking about how the ASEAN is working in uniting the varying epistemologies, cultures, and knowledges in our part of the world, and in uniting all these diverse cultures and worldviews, our unique ecology and geography. I know that many of you have comments, suggestions, and questions, but we will do our best to answer and to respond to these questions and comments on the event website. We hope that you will join us for the workshops because we will proceed directly to them. So let me give an overview of each of the sessions. For our workshop proper, we have one to address SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. We are going to be led by Dr. Zida Fatima Mohammed, who will talk about place-based citizen science for the conservation of water and ecosystems. To address SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, we have Dr. Camila Beledo to talk about Eco Squad goals, citizen science against plastic waste. Let's now address SDG 14, life below water, particularly on citizen science for coral reefs, where we have Brother Alfred Shields and Dr. Wilfredo Licuanan, who will monitor coral reef health using the ALUAN citizen science methods. And finally, SDG 15, Life on Land, we have the City Wild, Community Citizen Science for Urban Biodiversity Conversation, led by Maria Katrina Constantino and Abigail Faves, both of the Ateneo. Thank you to everyone who pre-registered for our workshops. We have these links to these workshops sent via email to those who pre-registered. For those who are not able to pre-register, please join us in SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. You can check out our chat box for the link to these workshops, to the workshops for SDG 6. If you need any assistance, please go to our help desk in our conference website. The link is posted here in our chat box. Before we end, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this workshop. We would like to thank our workshop coordinators and the team, Dr. Zida Mohammed, Dr. Chena Abeledo, Wilfredo Licuanan, Ms. Trinket Constantino, and Ms. Abby Favis, and to your teams. In advance, thank you for facilitating our workshops. This event would not have been possible without the support of our Campus Events Management Office. We thank you, Mr. Chris Castillo, Mr. Albert Santos, Ms. Aleli Diaz, Ms. Renate Gelsano, Mr. Ronald De Torrentegui, Mr. Vince Cosmiano, and Mr. June Asense. And in advance, we thank all of you for your participation in this webinar. We hope you will gain fresh insights in our workshops on how to bring citizen science to our classrooms, our corporations, our everyday lives, and as a way to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Please don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form. Again, we have that link on the chat, and we are entertaining requests for e-certificates, which will then be coursed through that same form. We will no longer come back to this plenary. When you get to your workshops, you will have an hour and a half to work with your facilitators, to discuss and share with each other, and then to have group photo op sessions. In the meantime, we thank you once again for your participation in this plenary. This is Ines Ponce de Leon of the Ateneo on behalf of the organizers Thank you. Enjoy the workshops. Happy Easter, happy Citizen Science Month, and have a wonderful day.